Quotations from myself, segment 61, quotation number 786. It is both regrettable and disappointing to an impartial observer that the artistic community has lately shown itself to be as monolithic and unbending in its blending defense, all done in the name of artistic freedom, of course, of even the most degrading and antisocial pornography. As a former communist leader, wherein their uncompromising, unequivocal, and, as a recent event had revealed, mostly hypocritical and self-serving ideological proclamation. 787. Romantic relations aside, most men prefer the company of other men, and most women the company of other women, and for at least one obvious reason. A man is judged and accepted by other men, and a woman by other women, not by the way they look, but what they are. That is why the very attractive member of each gender, respectively, prefer the company of the opposite sex, while the least attractive or even simply ordinary of their own. 788. There is nothing wrong with division of labor per se, as long as anyone willing and able to work has something to do. But the division of labor that leads to the situation when a growing number of people became superfluous and redundant, and the population is getting increasingly divided in those who are allowed and those who are not allowed to work, with the former getting relatively smaller and the latter relatively bigger all the time, such division cannot be defended, not only from the moral, but also from the economic point of view. 789. Only a person with a strong constitution can practice as a physician, who is constantly subjected to physical and psychological stress and exposed quite often to various types of contagious diseases. At the same time, since a doctor by necessity must be a very healthy person, he lacks personal experience of what ails his patients, not only in the specific cases, but, what is more important, in the general feeling of being sick. As a result, being only human, a doctor has little empathy with his patients, since it is hard for somebody who is satiated with food to understand the hungry, as for one who is healthy to empathize with the ill. Which brings us to the essential paradox contained in many common human dilemmas. The same quality which makes us suitable for certain occupation for one reason, very often impair our abilities to perform them well for the different ones. 790. Since the crowds consist mainly of individuals sharing at least one trait in common, a little capacity to comprehend the complexity of life, and who are also more or less aware of this deficiency and somewhat embarrassed by it, the crowd is forever enchanted with the things that are mysterious, obscure, and essentially incomprehensible. For such things make its member feel equal, albeit in a negative sense, to the wisest of men, who when faced with such inexplicable phenomenon, are just as helpless as the ordinary folks. From the collective point of view of the crowd, given the impossibility for the majority to attain an equality of the knowledgeable, an equality of the ignorant is a consolation prize. An equality of the ignorant as a consolation prize is vastly preferable to the painful acknowledgement of personal inability to understand when others do. A man, no matter how mediocre he is, loathes to admit being not as smart as the next fellow. $7.91. While those who are used to understand most of the thing most of the time feel frustrated and diminished when confronted by what is essentially unknowable, those who grew accustomed to life's general incomprehensiveness feel, on the contrary, comfortable and justified in the similar and familiar to them circumstances. 792. The obsession with subconscious, intuitive, dreamlike, etc. is characteristically prevalent among those who find the process of linear, that is, sequential, methodical, logical, and purposeful thinking too strenuous and tiresome, or simply boringly plodding. $7.93. When I was a small boy, my favorite book was Robinson Crusoe, the story of a man cast away by storm upon a desolate island and left with no other choice but either to recreate some resemblance of life out of bits and pieces of wreckage or to perish. Now looking back, I recognize a similar pattern in my own life. I too have been wrecked on the unknown shores more than once, and like Robinson Crusoe, had to rebuild some kind of new existence out of the salvaged remnants of the past and whatever was available in the present. The fact that I am still alive and presumably in a sound state of mind makes me feel a proud descendant of this ingenious and resourceful sailor who had managed to survive against all odds in the middle of nowhere. Moreover, I think we can all learn something from him, for with the exception of those few who are born with a silver spoon in the mouth, the rest of us have to do with whatever fate dangers throw in our path. Mind you, some still get more than others, compelling us to make what we can out of it. And even if it is nothing, to make life out of nothingness. 794. After the lifetime of absorbing the trials and tribulations of humanity, I have come to a rather unexpected, even paradoxical, yet inescapable, at least for me, conclusion. That the notion of justice, so universally admired and even worshipped, must be chiefly responsible for the man's seemingly endless misery. For when I look at the animal world, where the might is always right, and the weak know well enough that they have no other choice but to submit to the strong in order to survive, theirs one and only concern, I see how much more harmonious and much less violent it actually is in comparison with man's world, where the common perception of unfairness and unquenchable thirst for justice leads to perpetual strife in which the strong, no matter how unfair they are, still always triumph at the end, and the weak, regardless how justified they are, never gain anything permanently, despite horrendous suffering sacrifices. Such an unequal struggle inevitably entails. 795. Though most poetry is written to be enjoyed or disgusted with in the privacy of reader's solitude, it nevertheless can benefit from, and its evocative power be enhanced by, reading it aloud in public, though not necessary by the poets themselves. For they tend to be somewhat reverential, overprotective, and let's be honest, a bit too proud of their creations, almost like certain mothers who really showing off their kids as if trying to tell the world, look how smart and beautiful my children are, and since it's me who has produced them, I must be at least as smart and beautiful as they are. Furthermore, the audience itself, to extend the mother-child analogy, is treated sometimes as a collective child when a poet reading his own poem displays somewhat excessive pleasure in declaiming each word and phrase, as if inviting the listeners to share such a delightful feast, the invitation perilously close to ingratiation, in a manner similar to what a mother would often do when trying to tempt the child with a new food by first putting it in her own mouth and affecting that most satisfied and delightful expression on her face. Of course, some poets are fully aware or partially aware. Of course, some poets are fully or partially aware of this phenomenon and attempt to develop some technique of detachment. But admittedly, it isn't easy. So failing that, the next best things to do is to ask somebody else, preferably one who isn't a poet, but likes your poetry, to read it instead of you in the public. To ask somebody who doesn't particularly like your poetry is to expose your work to the danger of being grossly distorted, which certainly, unless one is highly pronounced masochist, tendency has to be avoided at all costs. 796. Even the poorest of the poor have their own elite, who tries to and succeeds in appropriating the disproportionate amount of the miserable crumbs left to this underclass. Every subgroup, no matter how low it is on a socio-economical scale, develops its own hierarchy of privilege through the universal technique of violence, intimidation, connections, deception, scheming, etc. Whenever there is something, be it money, food, shelter, position, honors, etc., in such quantity that more people desire it than is available, these tools are automatically used by those who would make sure that they are the ones who get what everybody else wants, and as much as possible of it, the rest be damned. 797. Most lives are like one-way street. When the poor entering it, you then have no choice but continue driving in one's taking direction, for the fear of being punished for trying to turn around and change it.